Hey everybody, welcome to Adventures in Neuropathology. I'm Dr. Andrea Gilbert. Today I want to talk to you about normal brain anatomy. So as you can see, we're doing something a little bit different. This is the first time that I'm working with video, so just bear with me. Today we want to talk about normal neuropathology. So let's get started. Okay, so starting off, we see here an image. This is a normal human brain. This is very soon after it had been taken out of the person's skull. We can see here that we have a lateral view of the left side of the brain. This is the frontal lobe, the temporal lobe, parietal lobe, and occipital lobe. And what I want to show you today is a coronal section right around here. Okay, so if we were to take a knife and cut right around here, what would we see? So this is the normal brain in the fresh state. And then this is a section of the brain after it's been fixed in formalin. So here we go. We've taken a section of this brain right here, and we've made a cut through it, and this is what we see here. So let me take this out of the way there. Okay. Okay, and so what we see here is we see a coronal section of the brain that's cut through the front middle half of the brain, and we're going to go through some of the major neuroanatomical structures here. Okay, so let's start by pointing out where are we located within this brain. Okay, so as I mentioned before, we have a image here of the fresh gross brain, the lateral side. If we take a cut through this brain right about here, where we're cutting through the posterior aspect of the frontal lobe and the anterior aspect of the temporal lobes, this is essentially what we would find. Okay, so what we have here is the temporal lobes right here. The frontal lobe, the posterior aspect of the frontal lobe is right here. And we're cutting through the section, and we're cutting through the brain here right at the point where we can see this anterior commissure here. Okay, so there are two cerebral hemispheres. The left and the right brain. On this image, the right is on the right side and the left is on the left side. The two cerebral hemispheres are connected by this very thick white matter tract here. This is called the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum connects the left and right halves of the brain so that you can, the two halves of the brain can talk to each other. This is also a white matter tract that is connecting the left and right cerebral hemispheres, but particularly in the frontal lobe. So it's connecting the left and the right frontal lobes together so that they can talk to each other. Now this anterior commissure is leading into the basal ganglia. Basal ganglia is divided into several different sections. Right here is the putamen. Here we can see the external globus pallidus, or the globus pallidus externa. And then here we can see the globus pallidus, the internal globus pallidus, which is also called the interna, the globus pallidus interna. Okay, the globus pallidus here connects a little bit underneath. This is called the ventral pallidum, underneath the anterior commissure, which again is right here. So here we have the anterior commissure. Here we have globus pallidus connecting here with the this little portion of the globus pallidus here that is ventral to the anterior commissure. This is called the ventral pallidum. This area right here, this is called the substantia innominata. Which is a very fancy word. You can tell it to your friends at a cocktail party. The substantia nominata is very important because it contains the nucleus basalis of Maynard, or just the nucleus basalis, or you could just call it the basal nucleus. The nucleus basalis of Maynard is very important in Alzheimer's disease. In Alzheimer's disease, a major aspect of that disease is that the person's brain is not producing enough acetylcholine. And the acetylcholine is the acetylcholine for the entire brain is made in this area in the nucleus basalis of Maynard. And then from there, it kind of transfers to the rest of the brain. So the nucleus basalis of Maynard is very important for Alzheimer's disease. In addition, this area here where we have the putamen and the globus pallidus externa and interna, this area is called the lentiform nucleus. The lentiform nucleus is part of the basal ganglia. Basal ganglia also includes the caudate nucleus. This is the body of the caudate nucleus. We're kind of getting into the body and somewhat into the tail here. This is the body of the caudate nucleus. The caudate nucleus and the putamen together, they are called the striatum, or if you want to be more specific, the neostriatum. The caudate nucleus is very important in Huntington's disease. So there are multiple structures that are very much involved in Huntington's disease. But the caudate nucleus, that's going to be the board fodder for your students out there. Okay, and so what we have here, which is just above the putamen and the globus pallidus, what we have here is the internal capsule here on the right side and then also here on the left side. The internal capsule contains things like the corticospinal fibers and the corticobulbar fibers, and those are the fibers that are responsible for things like voluntary movement, things like that. So if you have a lesion here in the internal capsule, then that person is going to have issues involving voluntary motor control. And so we talked about the basal ganglia. Here is the internal capsule. The internal capsule acts as a separator between the basal ganglia, particularly the lentiform nucleus here, and then the thalamus. And we can see a little bit of the thalamus kind of poking out here. The thalamus is very important in the brain. It acts as a major relay station for all the sensory input into the brain. So things like somatosensory, when somebody touches your skin, that information is going to get relayed up into your brain, and then the thalamus will relay it to the appropriate area. So pretty much every sensory modality goes through the thalamus except for olfaction, but pretty much every other sensory modality is going to be relayed through the thalamus. So it's very important for sensory processing and also making sure that incoming signals get to where they need to go. Okay, so right above the thalamus here, between here, kind of coming off the corpus callosum, we have here the fornix. The fornix is involved in the memory system, so learning and memory. So basically memory and connecting with the hippocampus and making that whole Papez circuit. The internal capsule divides the lentiform nucleus from the thalamus. The internal capsule is located right here on the right side and then also right here on the left side. Okay, so do you see how there is a white matter tract right here, and then a gray matter tract, or a gray matter nucleus, and then a white matter tract here? Okay, so this capsule here is called the internal capsule. This capsule here is called the external capsule. And then this white matter tract here on the outside of this claustrum, which is the gray matter, this white matter tract here is called the extreme capsule. It really is. That's the name of it. Okay, so we have the extreme capsule, the external capsule, and then the claustrum right in between here. The claustrum is derived from the same word as claustrophobic. And so claustrophobic, when you think of the word claustrophobic, it's a phobia of being in tight, small spaces. And so claustrum is kind of the same thing, where it's in this tight space in between the external capsule here and then the extreme capsule here. Okay, so we talked about our different major white matter tracts, the corpus callosum and the anterior commissure. The two of those connect the left and right sides of the brain. The major white matter tracts running down through each side of the brain. This is the internal capsule, this is the external capsule, and here is the extreme capsule. And now we can go to the gray matter area right here on the external aspect of the extreme capsule. This is the insular cortex. Okay, so this here is the insula. And the insula is its own lobe. Okay, so the brain has 5 different lobes to it: the frontal, the parietal, the occipital, the temporal, and then the insular lobe. So there's 5 lobes. If you wanted to include the limbic lobe, that could be 6, but mostly there's 5 lobes. And the insular lobe is the only one that you cannot view from the external aspect of the brain. You have to kind of get your fingers in between the temporal lobe and the frontal lobe and kind of peel those apart. And if you were to put your fingers in here and peel down the temporal lobe and put your fingers in here and peel up the frontal lobe, then you would be able to see the the insular lobe in between this area. All right, moving on to other areas of the cortex here. We can see this area right here. Take a look. Let's see if we can get up in there. Okay, so here we can see this little structure right here. This is the anterior cerebral artery right here. And we can see here that this area here and this area here, this is the olfactory nerves. Okay, so here we have the olfactory nerve, here we have the one on the right side, the one on the left side, and these olfactory nerves are kind of embedded within this olfactory sulcus right here. The presence of the olfactory nerve, the generation or development of the olfactory nerve induces the development of this gyrus right here, which is called the straight gyrus, also known as the gyrus rectus. And this is an area that corresponds to the orbital surfaces of the brain, the undersurface of the frontal lobe. And so your eyes would sit a little bit anterior to this area and a little bit anterior to that area. This area of the brain is very susceptible to contusions, as is the anterior tips of the temporal lobes. I have a different video that talks about contusions and brain injury. Be sure to check that one out. And so this is an area that we look for contusions within these regions here. Okay, coming back to the full screen for this case, we can talk now about the blood vessels for this case. So if we look at the blood vessel here, this is the anterior cerebral artery, and actually the anterior cerebral artery kind of curves up and around the front part of the brain, and so we can see the branches off of that anterior cerebral artery. These branches here feed that vascular territory of the anterior cerebral artery. Here we have the middle cerebral artery. The middle cerebral artery feeds this vascular territory here, basically the entire lateral aspect of the cerebral hemisphere. This whole area is fed by the middle cerebral artery, whereas the anterior and midline portions of the brain are fed by the anterior cerebral artery here. Okay, so this is a whirlwind tour of normal anatomy in the coronal section. I did not go through everything because we would be here all day. So I hope that this was helpful to the students out there. So if you like this video, please subscribe to our channel. We are on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Please subscribe and you'll be notified when more videos come out. All right, so that has been your whirlwind tour of neuroanatomy with your favorite neuropathologist, Andrea Gilbert. I hope you enjoyed it. Join us next time on Adventures in Neuropathology. Thanks.